Welcome to the Troutman Sanders Battery and Storage Podcast. I'm your co-host, Cliff Sikora.
And I'm Bill Durasmo.
Batteries.
Storage.
Podcast. Guests.
Analysis.
Conversation.
Tune in.
Rate.
Review.
Let's go. Welcome to the Troutman Sanders Battery and Storage Podcast. We are back for 2020. After a fairly successful 2019, we ended with 4 episodes in a whirlwind Q4. But the whirlwind's really out there in the storage industry, isn't it, Bill? I mean, we're not just making this up. It's we're just reporting the facts, man.
Yes, exactly. It was a busy 2019. Glad that you're back to listen to us here in 2020. And we should just dive right in.
Why not? Without further ado, let's tell the gentle listeners about what happened in 2019, which was, as they say, a watershed year for the battery and storage space, as it were. So to talk about what happened in 2019 and a little bit of a forecast for the projections going forward, where would we look? I mean, there's lots of information. I think there's consultants out on the stump that talk about how many hours a day they read and what they read and how much they read because there's so much information. But where would we go?
Well, of course, we would turn to Julian Dumoulin-Smith, who is an equity analyst with Bank of America.
Ah, yes. And would he tell us all the details of the storage business? I would say not, but get a pretty good handle on where things are from a money perspective. And he's really good in the power side and short and sweet. So we like that part. What does he say? Does he, B of A put out a report here earlier in the month?
January 30th, they put out a report, renewables trends for 2020, and focusing particularly on storage. The interesting thing is, so some of our episodes last year, and I'm thinking back to the Mike Hopkins one in particular, talked about the difficulty of bankability and sort of comparing and contrasting with the IPP sector when we had the gas revolution, when everyone was building CCGTs and then entering into traditional project finance arrangements, and we were comparing and contrasting to that era. I mean, one of the things that Julian focuses on is bankability, and he says storage bankability remains an Achilles heel. And what he says is that storage is definitely more, quote unquote, merchant and IPP-like, but then he says forward-looking, we'll see financing adapt around higher risks.
Right.
So I want you to react to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we are seeing in Julian's report, I think highlights it, and it's interesting to see what folks are comparing in their notes regarding financing and how it's getting done and the different sorts of models that are out there. And of course, one of the things that I find on the stump and getting out there is folks just not being as adept at the different sorts of utilities and providers we have in the United States. I mean, muni, co-op, and of course financing and the use of these assets is completely different. But from a private finance perspective, I think that the project finance folks being used to PPAs and contracts to back the revenue, we're not there yet, Julian is saying. So he's saying, I think that we are seeing financing. We're seeing merchant financing. And that merchant financing is one-off, and it's structured. And that's a little bit better than what Mike said just 3-4 months ago, which was not seeing it. And I feel like maybe we've turned a bit of a corner, at least in maybe Q2, Q3, Q4 last year, and we'll see it further in 2020 with Julian's statement. So I think that project, standalone storage, it appears is right on the cusp of being financed as standalone, but on a merchant basis. And so the risks attendant there are really what people are coming to us with, actually. And it's one of the most interesting things that I've been doing in the past few years. But.
Well, I think later in the report he talks about how storage costs decline So the costs are declining, and they support expanding use cases, and we're seeing nascent opportunities for standalone storage based on value stacking multiple revenue streams. So we've talked about the importance of the value stack, and I think what he's saying is that if you can stack services like, okay, ancillary services, energy, if you can qualify for capacity, fine. I think you and I we've talked about the importance of, if there's a way to stack in there the transmission side as well. Sure. And that creates other issues, of course, from a regulatory perspective. But anyway, I think the B of A report is positive, but still sort of talking about how things haven't been standardized yet.
Right, exactly. You don't sort of have a resi solar lease model. You don't have a standard PPA finance model. And so it's kind of all over the place a little bit, which is interesting. And some of the contracts that are coming out there are, some of them look like they're from the land of misfit toys. I mean, they try to take the PPA model and graft it on to this facility, this type of resource, and it's just not the same. I mean, the risks just aren't. For instance, the role of the OEM, the role of the O and M, as well as the OEM, in developing storage and putting it in place is really paramount. I mean, when you rely on somebody to just come in there, do a full wrap, put the box in the parking lot, hook it up, and deal with it, that's very different, right, than the utility, what we used to call the DUG, dealing with engineering issues and dealing with being the one on the site and folks doing the plant operations. It's all about, a lot of times, what's going to happen during the performance of the contract itself, which folks just don't know yet. I mean, we know that storage works. We know it works great. But a banker is going to look at you and go, well, prove to me that an unsupported stone will fall.
Right.
So it's a little bit of a different standard as to whether, it's great, but is it bank great? Well, we're getting there, it looks like. We're getting there.
Well, and to dive in a little bit more, I was just at a conference in Nashville, and one of the things was we still haven't wrapped our minds around what the warranties should look like and how you dovetail that sort of warranty uncertainty in contracting.
Right. And who's going to wear that risk and how, right?
Right.
Because if you're the OEM and you're bringing the battery to the table, right, you are warranting essentially not just the product itself, and you may get that warranty from the manufacturer, right, from the manufacturer, which is probably in Asia somewhere. And how does that warranty read through? Where's the recourse? Who's got the recourse? So in other words, a lot of times, if I'm the warranty holder, I certainly want to have dominion and control of operation of the facility, because I don't want you running it and screwing with my warranty, right? I mean, we're seeing that in a couple of places. I mean, there's lots of different models that people can do, but one that you see in New York is you put in the battery and I dispatch it.
Well,
you
right.
make sure it's available for me, and I dispatch it. And then the great question is, well, wow, what do I get when you get done using my car, which is an issue near and dear to our hearts right now. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, no, and the state of charge management issue, which FERC has been hyper-focused on. But if the warranty says one thing about cycling up and down, right, and you've got to manage your battery and in accordance with RTO instructions. I mean, I think that was one of the issues in PJM early on, is that you had just a disconnect between how the batteries were supposed to be cycled and how they were in practice. Right. And so that you have all of those issues which add to complications. But I still think we're trying to figure out how to monetize all of the functionality of these virtual Swiss Army knives.
Right. But I think what's interesting is bankability, financeability translated to you and I folks that have been in the business for a while and others, to me, bankability gets to who gets to develop it, who gets to own it, who gets to take the monetary goodies from it, as far as the return goes. Because if you're saying that it has to be done on balance sheet, you're talking about one set of folks. And if it's off and it's merchant, you're talking about another set of folks.
Well, sure.
Basically. But the good news, I think, is that in some respects, what you're seeing is that hopefully you get a menu of risk options for investors to be involved in. And I think that's the deal. You see, for example, Julian said a lot of the growth is going to be in car batteries. I mean,
Yes.
you see a lot of the major trends being in EVs. I think Tesla stock went up to 1,000 the other day. I mean, it made a boatload of money. Finally, we're seeing some movement there. But around these risks, around the risk issues, right? One of them that we're seeing, and let's move on to sort of another major issue that's sitting on the table for 2020, or at least that folks think is FERC Order 841, which I think we all agree was at least the clarification or manifestation of rules that kind of were already there, and just how storage would fit into it. Not that it wasn't a great order, not that it didn't put a flame onto the fuse of the storage bomb, but a lot of it was restatements of law that had already been there.
Yeah, I mean, it was, just to recap really quickly, IPL filed their complaint against MISO.
IPL being?
Indianapolis Power and Light. I represented them in that case. And the FERC said, you know what, MISO, you need to amend your tariff and your business practices, et cetera, to accommodate the participation of storage resources in your markets. Order 841 essentially genericized that relief to all the RTOs. All the RTOs made compliance filings. FERC has acted on most of those compliance filings at this point, and there are going to be further compliance filings. There's a million details about different sub-issues about how these things should be treated, how they qualify for capacity, what transmission charges they're exempt from. There's a load of issues on the sort of, okay, I have a battery, how do I participate in the RTO market? But there was, I think, an aspect of the order that admittedly I did not focus on initially that you focused on, and I don't think we focused on this podcast. I know you want to talk about, which is how the jurisdictional issue has bubbled up through a rulemaking that, quite honestly, I don't think anyone at FERC had anticipated was going to end up
in the D.C. Circuit,
right?
Yeah.
On this issue.
On this issue, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So, I think the GenBright case that just was issued on Monday, February 3rd. We're doing this podcast February 7th on Friday. The GenBright order is very interesting, and that's an example of the jurisdictional dispute that we'll talk about a little bit pending in the D.C. Circuit. Bottom line, states against feds. That's
we're familiar with that.
You can't get much clearer than that. It's states say we want it our way, and the feds say I want it that way, kind of like the Backstreet Boys used to say. Right? So
well, yeah, I mean, and we could talk about how you look at jurisdiction in this industry for a long time, but I'm boiled down in my brain, in my feeble brain, would be, look, there's sort of facilities-based jurisdiction, or
and
there's
talk about that for a minute. How does that break down?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, two prongs. One, this is the way I look at it: facilities-based and sort of transaction-based as to what's happening in terms of the flow of
now
power.
We're talking about a federal law here. We're not right. We're talking about you're talking about a specific federal law and what it says. What is that?
Well, it's the Federal Power Act.
Okay.
And so broken down, roughly speaking, it's okay. If it's distribution, the state has jurisdiction over distribution facilities.
Local distribution.
Right. Facilities. If it's transmission, then the feds, FERC, has jurisdiction over transmission. But the other aspect to jurisdictional analysis is, well, what's happening in the transaction? And very simply, if it's a sale for resale, that is FERC jurisdictional. Or if you are participating in wholesale markets, RTO markets, for instance, that is FERC jurisdictional. What I think, and I'll sort of tee this up for you, Cliff, is everyone's gotten confused as to how those two prongs work.
Well, I don't think they are. I don't think anybody's confused. I think although if you read Utility Dive today, February 7th, you'll see a competitor law firm, I guess, I don't know, saying this is absolutely one of the most complex areas of the law that they could possibly ever imagine. And I think, Bill, you said it quite simply. The Supreme Court really kind of decided the issue pretty clearly in EPSA a few years back, saying on the retail demand response stuff, to the extent that it participates in wholesale markets, states have a nice day. And here, the issue boils down to the TAPS case, which was interim order for the D.C. Circuit when 888 went up to the Supreme Court in New York versus FERC. And that case says facilities don't matter. Facilities mean nothing. If the sale is at wholesale, then whatever the wire is, whatever the transaction is, he's talking about a FERC jurisdictional transaction. So the bottom line here is, and Sandra Kagan said it in the EPSA order, and FERC filed its brief in the 841 case, D.C. Circuit, on Friday, saying, hey, look, all of this stuff is inextricably intertwined. Retail and wholesale have always impacted one another. You can't make them hermetically sealed from one another. I think one of the court cases uses that term. And it's a fact of economic life, as Sandra Kagan said, that these markets are intertwined. And why is that? Because until things change dramatically, which they might, why? Because batteries move pretty quickly, but until you can charge something through the air, until you can move electricity through the air, you're going to need a wire. And if you're going to need a wire, the two go together. And so if the two go together, what the federal government, what the feds have said is, that's federal jurisdiction. The states are challenging it, though, in the D.C. Circuit. What do they say?
Well, the states are focused on the fact that it's the batteries would be connecting at distribution.
At local distribution, which the Power Act, the words of the Power Act say is state jurisdictional. And so based on that nexus to the facilities, the states say, no, this is terrible. And then move to the 10th Amendment argument, which is, well, you're commandeering state authority, which is you can't do under the 10th Amendment.
But it ignores, as you say, the EPSA case and Kagan in pointing out, but when you participate in wholesale markets, that's a different story. It doesn't really matter.
Right. And so as most business people say to us, our clients, what the hell does this mean to me?
Why should I care?
Why should I care? Well, for one thing, the Genbright case shows that there's confusion. I mean, that does not mean that it's a difficult issue. I don't think it is. I don't think it is, and this is, again, my opinion, and, you get that little disclaimer at the end of the podcast. But it's not that difficult because if the entity wants to participate at wholesale, which the Genbright guys did, they wanted to be in the ISO New England capacity market, and the local utility told them they should hook up to a distribution line or whatever their configuration they wanted was distribution. Oops, sorry, you didn't get into the ISO New England queue. And why didn't you? Well, they told us we were distribution. It shouldn't be the way the railroad gets run. I mean, let's face it.
Right.
No offense, but there shouldn't be this kind of impact on commerce with a resource that is clearly one of the most efficient in the market at providing a whole bunch of different stuff. We just saw what was the price in California for the solar plus storage? It's like $13 or some megawatt hour.
Oh, per megawatt hour, yeah. No, I mean, I think the practical to get back to your question on why should they care in the Genbright case, it's just a great example, and it's a recent example, of course, this week, where it has a practical effect on trying to do business. I mean, basically, you had I forget how many megawatts of renewable resources that wanted to participate in, I guess they call it in New England, the FCA. It's basically the next round of capacity auctions, and they weren't allowed to. And so it has a detrimental effect on commerce. So if you're trying to just conduct business in this space, we need clarity. And hopefully the courts will provide it fairly soon. And we recommend that you take a look at FERC's brief in the appeal of 841 and 841A, because it's, whatever side you come down on the issue, the FERC brief is really well written, and it's instructive on prior case law and how the courts have looked at these issues.
Yeah, to be fair, there is probably a good bit. If I saw myself as a state commissioner, particularly, I would think in an urban area, right? And I was very concerned about service quality, service issues to mom and pop kettle, my retail customers and my residential customers, and they were beginning more and more to rely on storage behind the retail meter that is not aggregated. That's certainly something that the state should be involved in. I think FERC gets that, right? And then, but to the extent that that aggregated activity participates in wholesale markets, that's the EPSA case.
Right.
Right. So
asked and answered.
Right. Asked and answered. So but I do think there's an area of very valid interest for states to be involved in regarding, what folks are doing, what firms are doing. For instance, I remember back in the old days when I was on Capitol Hill, and I used to get lobbied all the time by the heating and air conditioning and boiler people because they were angry that the utilities were in that business. And I kind of said, sorry, it is what it is. It is what it is. So,
Yeah, no, I think, look, I used to work at a state commission, and I don't want to carry a brief for either side. I just think that in this particular case, EPSA already decided this basically the same issue, and at the same time, I understand what you're saying. States obviously have a legitimate interest in resource procurement, and I think that's why this has become a bit of an emotional issue. Is what I'm sensing. Is because there's this larger issue of, FERC's going in one direction. Like, for instance, we haven't talked about the MOPR issue in PJM, but now you see we just had the GenBright case over in the ISO New England auction. But you have FERC with this sort of continuing interest in maintaining its RTO model. And then the states, ironically enough, are the ones that are really pushing for change in terms of resource procurement, saying it's the states that are the ones that are pushing for the renewable resources, the changing of the generation portfolio.
Right, and you see that tension at FERC between Rich Glick and the majority and various people taking various opinions. Cheryl was on his side for certain of those issues. But the question is sort of the old one of, I liken it to a baseline in EPA environmental regulation, right? It's states can always go above the baseline, but
True.
And so how do you accommodate people that want to do better? How do you accommodate that relative to markets?
And pertinent to this podcast, the storage is sort of now the next front.
Sure.
Right. There was one other issue
because it takes away the argument that variable resources won't be there when you need them.
Oh, of
right?
course.
It just cuts that out at the knees, and people don't really know how to handle that. They're like, okay.
Well, yeah, we've talked some about the duck curve issue, right? And then the storage's ability to maybe help with that. Right.
Yeah. And coming back, though, to the very beginning of the pod, where we talked about merchant, I wonder if one of the bets people are making is, hey, if we move to that kind of a variable resource mix in the aggregate, right? Somebody somewhere is going to need storage because there's got to be variability out there that's uncontracted for. Almost like maybe we're moving into the gas business with people that build storage for storage sake. Not there yet. But I wonder if somehow somebody says, Well, I contract. I know that the market price of whatever these products and services I'm providing are above my costs generally, or I predict that they will be, and so I can get it financed. But I wonder if one of the things that might happen is sort of aggregate storage and the ability to sort of charge and discharge on an aggregate basis. Because most of the time we talk about solar plus storage, now it's on site, right? And so you wonder if there's a pairing that's...
Well, it's interesting if the RTOs, and I have not heard this, but it just sparks a thought in my mind. Are the RTOs going to try to develop some kind of storage product?
Yeah, that's the next thing.
You know,
right?
Valley filling or peak, I hate to use the term peak shaving, but one of those products. But in any event, one other topic, and we could circle back to the 841 appeal and jurisdictional issue if you want. But one other topic I think was a major development towards the end of the year that I also want to get on the table is the storage's transmission-only asset debate and the MISO filing that went in on that.
The doctrinal dispute.
I think we'll just start with the MISO filing. It went in towards the end of 2019. I forget the exact date. But the point was they finally made their filing to implement and make clear in attachment FF, which is their regional transmission planning stuff, make clear that, yes, you can have a storage resource be classified as transmission, go through the MTEP process, and you can add that to your transmission cost of service collected through the famous attachment O. And it spells out the type of showing that you would have to make through the MTEP process. But basically, it's is this a cost-effective solution type of analysis
from a wires perspective?
Yes, and so it's all intuitive, I think. But I do think it's significant. So I don't think it's remarkable in that it did something unexpected. But I think it's important for the listeners to understand. So now you've got RTOs that are looking with specific tariff provisions, specific rules in place. Hey, you can get transmission cost of service transmission recovery with respect to a storage asset.
Right. And if you're somebody who's in both the wires business and the gen business in some ways, if you still have some kind of integration, it's an interesting issue. For example, what happens if you started off for one aim, you want to start it off as a T, but then it ends up G. You got to get in the queue, for if it's G. There's all sorts of kind of weird little doohickeys that are associated with it, including can the same battery be both? And people just get all wound around the axle on that one.
Right. Well, in one of our previous episodes when we had John Fernandez on, he talked about the fact that these battery installations are like vertically integrated utilities all in one building. And it's interesting to think about that when you think about a discrete asset being vertically integrated, but it really is. And so in terms of functionality.
And functionality is the key word, right? Because that gets back to first principles of Bond-Bright utility rate making. What is the function, right? And so people get all wound around the axle about what it is that we're doing. And to me, we allocate costs all the time in the utility business, and we're able to bucketize what the costs are. Now, there are operational issues, right, with the merchants not being able to know the transmission information, et cetera, et cetera. But, geez, I mean, from a cost allocation perspective, we should be able to do that.
You should be able to do it. I think where the rubber hits the road on this, and I think you have smart people who are thinking about this undoubtedly, but you'd have to subdivide it in some way. You could, if you really get into the weeds on it, but you could subdivide the actual building and say this row over here of these racks and racks of cells. If you've ever been inside a grid scale battery, it's just racks and racks of these cells,
right,
with inverters on the top. Hey, those that's for the merchant function. And then you can
actually tag it.
Yeah,
this specific part of the battery. People, at least that would make them happier.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. This part's for transmission. I understood.
Yeah, like nodes, 1,833 through 5,275. Those nodes over there are for the merchant function, and then those nodes from 5,000 whatever and up is for the transmission function. But no,
it's all in the same box. Bill. Isn't it the same facility?
And I'm just using an extreme example, but I think you could come up with other ways, obviously, of subdividing it and dividing up and bucketizing the costs.
Speaking of subdividing, we have our first viewer mail, but it's not viewer, it's listener mail.
Sure.
We do. We have our first listener mail. An individual who listened to the podcast comments, well, now, how would such a split battery be handled under the standards of conduct? That's a really interesting question. But I think that what we're talking about in terms of subdividing, gentle listener, would be two specific entities, one taking one attribute of the facility and one taking the other set of attributes. And so then you're talking about two entities, one being essentially a transmission function organization, and the other one being part of a generation organization. And so there's a lot of thinking to be done on it, but I think the point about subdividing is it isn't necessarily an asset that, at least for these purposes, at least for purposes of these discussions, is a vertically integrated asset within a utility fleet. We're talking about calling out a SATOA function. What does that stand for again?
Storage as transmission only asset.
Oh, thank you. That was very good. That was really good. I'll give you a little golf clap on that.
Well, and MISO has said that this is transmission only asset. The stuff that we're talking about is coming down the pike, where MISO is going to start grappling with dual functionality, where you have a merchant aspect and a transmission aspect. And I think the standards of conduct question that we got from our good listener is a good one. And that'll have to be hashed out. You'll have to have different personnel who won't be able to pass non-public transmission information over to each other.
But, on the standards of conduct issue, while we're sort of musing on it, and none of this is legal advice, by the way.
None.
But while we're musing on it, the big issue with batteries is that the RTO needs to control it, right? I mean, that's part of what the issue is. They want to control it. So if they control it, what kind of transmission information are we really talking about? I mean, I think the point about the SATOA in some respects is that it's dedicated to that functionality, because you're in the planning function. You're putting it in there as something that's available to the operator. Right. When the operator needs it for whatever it is.
For grid support service, a capacitor bank type service, sure. Yeah. So you have to make the case in the planning process that it's going to be able to perform that function. So on the
there's nothing really that your gen guy could get that would be valuable anyway. Now that said, we know the way the standards are written, but still, in point of fact, this is a little bit different than a non-RTO transmitter and information associated with that being passed over to merchants. It's a difference.
Yes, difference. But yeah, no, I just wanted to make sure that we got the SATOA issues on the table.
So what's coming up for 2020? What are you doing in the next few quarters to further the cause of storage, Bill?
Well, it's coming up. It's just bubbling up in a variety of ways. We've seen interest in the deployment of storage in a variety of contexts, including folks who are being served under requirements contracts. We now have a live case at FERC. And, so you've got...
There's a number of them out there where people are trying to use the battery to essentially reduce their costs,
And right, and that'll be hashed out in a variety of settings. You've got burgeoning interest in state procurement efforts to try to firm up, as we talked about, renewables. You've got, we've had clients come to us say, look, we're going to go out to the market with an RFP. We want your help in trying to develop a template.
Right. So, and there's a lot of thinking that needs to be done, kind of, as we said, circling back to make these things more cookie cutter, more bankable, more run-of-the-mill. The paper's got to get more standardized. And so I think maybe over the next year we're going to see or try to get more standardized paper, and I think we're going to be involved in that. Please, you got any ideas? Send them to us. You know where we are. We're willing to talk about anything in the storage space you want to discuss, anything that's puzzling you, and there's a lot of puzzles out there. So with that, thanks very much, and have a good one.
Take care.
These recorded materials are designed for educational purposes only. This podcast is not legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individual participants. Troutman Sanders does not make any representations or warranties, express or implied, regarding the contents of this podcast. Information on previous case results does not guarantee a similar future result. Users of this podcast may save and use the podcast only for personal and other non-commercial educational purposes. No other use, including without limitation, reproduction, retransmission, or editing of this podcast may be made without the prior written permission of Troutman Sanders.